For discussions about the latest with the White House, we are having in our Beijing studio Rick Dunham, co-director of the Global Business Journalism Program at Tsinghua University, earlier a Washington correspondent. In Washington, D.C., we have Joe Rubin, president of Washington Strategy Group, also former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Also in Washington, we are joined by Lester Munson, who's partner at the BGR Group, a government relation company. He also serves as adjunct faculty at Johns Hopkins University. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Three American gentlemen helping me and our audience all over the world to understand what exactly is going on in the White House right before the Christmas. So let me go to you, Mr. Rubin, about the latest discussion, quote unquote, taking place in the White House in front of the world. What do you make of it?
Well, thanks, Jen. It's quite remarkable still here in Washington to think that we can be surprised by anything, but yesterday was a surprise. And really to see the Democratic leaders debating with President Trump and Vice President Pence sitting next to him like a potted plant, basically, was a remarkable sight. And clearly right now the president is trying to figure out how to get leverage to move his agenda with Democrats poised to take control of the House, and he doesn't have much leverage. And I think that we're witnessing the sort of the collapse of strategy for the Trump administration when dealing with Congress, and that portends difficulties for the next 2 years for the administration.
Mr. Rubin, help us to understand further about the Republican leadership. There has been some reshuffling within the leadership itself. Paul Ryan, at the age of 50, already quote-unquote retired, as we all know. So President Trump now needs to deal with a mixture of both so-called the old and new when it comes to leadership. And how much will he be able to convince the other side to be on his side once again?
Yes, well, with Paul Ryan departing, it's another demonstration that the House Republican caucus is incredibly difficult to manage. And President Trump is going to have to really look in the mirror and decide what he wants to achieve for these next 2 years, because the Democrats in the House will have a significant majority, and in the Senate, the Republicans have a narrow majority, but many of their senators will now be up for re-election in just 2 years and in many competitive states. So will he, we use the word triangulate, will he try to cut deals with the Democrats in order to move an agenda, or will he take a more aggressive partisan position to try to demonstrate to his base that he is standing up for what they've elected him to achieve, and not really cutting any deals? And it's really, we're at a fork in the road, and for the president with 2020 coming up, the presidential election,
right,
my sense would be that he's going to want to fight. We saw that yesterday in the Oval Office, but then the day after, fighting only gets you good headlines on TV. He still has to run the country, otherwise the entire enterprise will collapse, and Republicans in Congress will be very concerned.
Well, Mr. Rubin, I mean, you are still holding on to the old Bible, I'm afraid, when you are saying that, because you have a president that do not necessarily, you know, have the same amount of concern about things that you have, possibly. Your priorities are very different from one another. I have to remind you, Mr. Rubin, about that cold fact, apparently.
Well, I agree with that, but he still is going to have to demonstrate to the voters who flipped the House towards Democrats, the suburban voters in purple states, that he is worthy of a second term, and they want practical outcomes. And so I agree with you, personality-wise, completely, but in terms of strategy for winning the next election, if he doesn't appeal to that group, he's going to lose significantly, as will the Republicans in the Senate.
Mr. Rubin, I want to have your expertise back as well. Earlier, we heard Mr. Munson talking about the current president should really think about how to prioritize the issues when it comes to constituencies. To grab tightly to some, well, throw away the others. But Mr. Rubin, obviously this president is trying to have all the options of issues juggling at the same time. He just wants to maintain as much control of those as possible for as long as possible until the very last moment to make the choice, isn't it? It seems to be his strategy, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, this president seems to believe that he can negotiate through chaos and through the execution of chaos. And that's his approach. And at the end of the day, he makes pronouncements left and right and then ends up somewhere in a muddy middle. And we just saw in the past week and a half, the president said we spend too much on defense, we should cut defense spending. Then a couple days later, he says we should spend more on defense, we should spend $750 billion. Currently, we're spending about $720 billion. So it's chaos. It makes it very difficult for policymakers on Capitol Hill to navigate. The danger here is that the president's word has become so cheapened and so unreliable that for Congress, it's like negotiating with a wet noodle. We have seen this many times in high-stakes negotiations, and then nothing happens. The immigration debate, as Les points out, a year and a half ago or so, there was a potential deal, then it fell apart, and nothing has happened since. And so it's governing by tweet, and it's governing by chaos, and I think the American people are tired of it. We saw in these elections a record victory by House Democrats in terms of aggregate vote total. So the American people kind of voted their views of this governing style, and it wasn't very pretty for the president.
From your political experience and your reading of this president, together with the so-called consensus within Washington, how would you understand that? I mean, earlier Mr. Munson repeatedly suggesting that the president could be and will be possibly focus on some of the issues such as relationship with China and some of the others. In this part of the world, the people are very concerned that a president in the United States being further put into a political corner could, in a way, out of proportion, work on some of the issues as Mr. Munson just mentioned, including the U.S. relationship with China, which will be very dangerous for one of the most important bilateral relations in the world. So, Mr. Rubin, given your experiences in the State Department, how do you read domestic politics vis-a-vis the future choices?
So there's an expression we have, it's called wag the dog. It's when an American president is facing difficulties at home and sort of conjures up an international crisis to raise his popularity and avoid the downsides that he's experiencing. And so there's always that concern that in the latter half of a term of a president, especially one where they don't have much authority over Congress, that they take unilateral action to raise global temperatures and make them, as the only commander-in-chief that we have in our system, more popular, more stronger. I don't think that necessarily works in this case. Americans are not excited about the idea of an aggressive war posture or of the trade war. Americans are not rallying to President Trump's side on that. And I would also want to mention that with Les's good point about running on the record, in many ways Democrats ran against the Trump record, not against the Trump personality, and they were very disciplined in this past election. And I think the Democrats are very energized about the record that President Trump is trying to execute, and that would be in many ways a gift to Democrats to talk about climate change and health care and other kinds of and economic inequities, the other issues that the president's been very bad on from a Democratic perspective. So there is a deep concern that he may try to do something irresponsible, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be popular for this president.